and welcome everybody to this month's Connect with Remedy webinar. During today's presentation, you are able to ask Q&A of our panelists in the Q&A pod. During the presentation, all Q&A and the recording of this webinar will be posted to the YouTube channel as well as in communities within a week of today's presentation. Today's topic is on troubleshooting email engine problems, and I'll turn this over to Doug Reif.
Thank you, Greg, and thanks everyone for coming today. The agenda today will be to start with a brief overview of the email engine. Then we'll take a high-level look at an email engine environment and the various areas where we could expect potential problems. Then we'll spend quite a bit of time looking at common problems and troubleshooting those. We'll end with some references so you can go back and do some research on your own and then follow it up with a Q&A session. We'll start with a high-level view of the features and functionality of the email engine. First, as you know, the email engine is used to send notifications. This is extremely important since many of our companies or customers help enforce their SLAs by sending out email notifications. So these notifications can be sent to groups or individuals. They can be formatted with HTML or plain text. And I don't know how many of you know this, but you can include query results in your notifications. So for example, maybe you want to send out a notification that somebody has a critical ticket they need to work on. Well, you can also include with that notification a query result that shows them all of their open critical tickets as well. So that's pretty cool. You can create and update records using incoming emails. End users can use the default template format to include the necessary information for the email engine to be able to process the request and create a ticket on a specified form. You can also use HTML to customize those templates so that end users have a better looking, easy to use format for creating records through email. And you can forego the template altogether and just use free-form email. This requires that you build workflow to parse the message, but it's not too difficult, and it provides a really easy way for end users to create tickets using email. Lastly, you can also use all of these methods to create integrations from any third-party source that has the ability to send an email message. So, an example might be you have a mainframe system. It can send email, then you can create an integration. Email also supports approving and rejecting approval requests through an email response. Now, this is a diagram showing the physical layout of a typical email engine environment. You can have multiple active email engines that reside on the same boxes as the AIR server, and that's just because that's how the installation does it by default. But the email engine connects to the AIR system through a load balancer, or at least that's the desirable environment, is to go through a load balancer, because this can help distribute your email engine load the same way that you distribute your user traffic. Here's a logical view of the same environment. Email engines reside on the AIR server host, but they have no real direct connection to that specific AIR server. Each email engine is capable of handling multiple mailboxes. In this example, I have 3 mailboxes that are handled by 2 email engines. I have them distributed so that email engine 1, you can see the box there, is handling POP3 incoming mailbox and my first SMTP outgoing mailbox, while email engine 2 is handling my second SMTP mailbox. If you look at the ranks, you can see that if either one of these email engines goes down, the other one will handle all 3 mailboxes. So with this layout, I get distribution of my workload as well as high availability. Since we're going to be talking quite a bit about troubleshooting the email engine, it's important to understand the areas of an email engine environment that are at potential risk. Obviously, the first point is the email engine itself, number 1 there. The email engine is influenced by the email daemon.properties file, the centralized configuration settings for email engine, the service and the startup scripts that start the email engine, the mailbox configuration, the Java installation, as well as the JVM options and other things. The second area is the AIR system server. The components of the AIR server that influence the email engine are form and field permissions. These affect both incoming and outgoing messages. The security model for incoming email. You can set up the security model to use the login name, email address, or a security key. Workflow, and that includes incoming and outgoing. The third area is the post office. The post office has a lot of things that might affect the email engine, such as the mailbox and account settings, how you handle domain name handling, relaying, and forwarding of messages to different domains. Other post office settings, such as max connections, the support of protocols it has, the timeout settings, all these things that we've seen those have an effect on the email engine. Next area is the connection to AIR server. So the email daemon.properties file we're going to show you has information that helps it connect, the email engine connect to AR server. It includes a server name. It includes the Remedy application service password that's hard-coded into the email daemon properties file, whether or not you're going to use a private RPC socket, and whether the settings point to a load balance or directly to a local AR server. Next area is the connection to the post office. The post office is going to dictate what protocols are allowed, what ports are used, but you need to make sure those ports are open and being listened on. The post office is going to determine whether or not you have to use SSL or TLS. And the last area is service failover, which we'll talk quite a bit about today. The service failover operation manages the ranking and coordinates the mailboxes across the email engines in your environment. If the service failover isn't working correctly, the email engines won't know that they're supposed to be processing emails. Now, those are the 6 areas that are of potential risk, and we'll talk about several of those today.
Okay, going forward in this presentation, we'll be discussing a few of the most common problem areas and some troubleshooting techniques for the BMC Remedy email engine. We'll focus on 3 specific areas of configuration, connectivity, and performance. So let's get started with configuration. The first point of configuration we'll discuss is the AR system email mailbox configuration form. The purpose and functionality of this form is for the creation and managing of your incoming and outgoing mailboxes. Here you specify functionality with regards to the email engine behavior for incoming and outgoing email, protocol, security, and more. This is also where you will configure the email engine's connectivity to the mail server for each of your individual mailboxes. On the email mailbox configuration form, there are 3 common and required fields for each mailbox that you configure. First, we have the mailbox name. The value specified here can be any name of your choosing. As an example, you can specify the protocol and function in the name, such as shown here as test SMTP outgoing. This type of naming convention can make it easier to troubleshoot when reviewing the email engine logs, especially when you have multiple mailboxes. But again, this can be any name or naming convention of your choosing. The next field is the mailbox function. Here you specify either incoming or outgoing. Setting the mailbox function value for incoming or outgoing determines the visibility of certain fields displayed on the Advanced Configuration tab we'll see in a moment. And the third common and required field is status. In short, status turns on or off the mailbox. So select Enable to activate the mailbox to process your outgoing notifications or incoming emails, depending on the mailbox function. Select Disabled to keep the mailbox disabled and stop it from processing any outbound notifications or incoming emails for that specific mailbox. Now, probably a question you would have is, why would I want to set up mailbox to disable? Well, a couple of examples would be that you might want to create a mailbox for testing purposes and then disable it when your testing is done, but keep the mailbox configuration data in place for later testing. Another possibility is if you want to troubleshoot on a specific mailbox. For instance, say your incoming mailbox is having a problem. Disabling outgoing would allow the information in the logs to write information primarily for the incoming mailbox, thus allowing for your troubleshooting focus in the logs to be only for incoming. Here we are highlighting the Basic Configuration tab. The field data on this tab is essential information for connecting to the mail server. All the settings here are specific to each individual mailbox. The email server type is used to specify the protocols for each mailbox. As an AR system administrator, you must verify what protocols your mail server administrators have enabled on the mail server in order for you to confirm what protocols you can use for both incoming and outgoing mailboxes. The polling interval determines how often the email engine will check for an incoming mail from the mail server if the mailbox is incoming, or how often to check for new outgoing mail in the email messages form on the AR server if the mailbox is outgoing. You can have different polling intervals for different mailboxes. As noted in the field label, the polling interval can be in minutes or seconds. While the mailbox configuration form is where you set the interval number, the centralized configuration settings is where you determine if this is going to be minutes or seconds. This is done using the email parameter of mailbox polling unit is minutes and setting it to either true or false. The other remaining fields on the Basic tab are essential settings used to tell the email engine how to connect to the mail server. You have SSL for security, email server name, server port, server user, and server password. With regards to the user and password fields, it's important to note that the SMTP protocol is able to be configured on the mail server to allow for anonymous connections. So a username or password may not be required, but all the other protocols do require authentication information. Again, this is something you would check with your mail administrator to confirm the specific requirements for the various protocols in your environment. When using the MAPI protocol for either incoming or outgoing, the Basic tab will have only 3 fields: email server type, polling interval, and a previously hidden field called profile name. For this field, you will specify the MAPI profile you created for use with the email engine. When using Mbox, which is incoming only, the Basic tab will have also only 3 fields, which are email server type, polling interval, and another previously hidden field called inbox path. Here, you enter the full path and file name to the Mbox file corresponding to the user email account. As I mentioned earlier, the Advanced Configuration tab contains fields that are optional and vary depending on Mailbox function. They are used to define certain functionality and behaviors for the specific mailbox. Here we see the Advanced Configuration tab for a mailbox with the mailbox function of outgoing. Note the default outgoing mailbox field. You must have at least one default outgoing mailbox, and there can be only one. If you created another outgoing mailbox and set it to be the default outgoing mailbox, the previous one will be changed to a value of no. The fields in the default addressing area can be used to specify default recipients, while the fields in the default template section can help you define the look and feel of email notifications. Templates can be used for various purposes, such as company branding, and can include graphic elements allowing for an even more customized email experience. Now we see a screenshot of the Advanced Configuration tab for an incoming mailbox. These fields are used to determine the behavior of the email engine once it receives an incoming email. You will notice there are 2 sections: Action Configuration and Incoming Security Configuration. In the Action Configuration section, you have Email Action, for which the options are None, Parse, and Clear. If set to None, the rest of the fields are disabled. If set to Parse, the rest of the fields in this section are enabled and configurable. In the Incoming Security section are fields used for the security settings for incoming approval emails. Please review the AR System Mailbox configuration documentation to better understand the full functionality of these and all fields in the AR System Mailbox configuration form. So now that we've discussed some of the AR Mailbox configuration form, Doug's going to begin discussing service failover for the email engine.
So a key area for possible configuration issues is service failover. The symptoms observed are often that the email engines in the server group simply are not processing emails. And a likely cause is that service failover is not configured correctly. A good place to start is to check the service failover ranking and whiteboard forms. And the things we're going to look for are, number 1, the server names. Make sure that the server names that are ranked are actually the ones that are connected. We want to check the last heartbeat to confirm if the email engines are actually connecting. We'll check the email.log. And we'll check the AR System Server Group Operation Ranking Form to make sure that the service failover operation is ranked. So the first thing to look at is the Service Failover Ranking Form. This form is automatically populated when the email engine starts up for the first time. So that may have been quite some time ago, and the data that's in there may not be correct. So it's important to check this form to make sure that your mailboxes are here and that they're ranked correctly across your servers. Take note of the exact spelling and case of the server names, and take note of the ranks as well. The next slide, this is the Service Failover Whiteboard form. We need to make sure that the server names here are consistent with the names that we just saw on the ranking form, and as I mentioned, that includes the case. And take a look at the status. An email engine should only process emails if it's in an active status. If it shows active here, but it's not processing emails, then you need to focus your troubleshooting on the email engine itself, not the service failover. If an email engine shows waiting here, but you think it should be active, then the problem is with the ranking or the spelling or case of the server name, so you need to double check that again. Also, while you're here, check the heartbeat. If it's been more than a few minutes since the last heartbeat, then there's a problem with the email engine itself not sending the heartbeat. If the service failover settings look correct to you and the email engine still isn't processing, then we'll take a look at the email.log. We can gauge the service failover health from this log. So on an email engine that is supposed to be active for one or more mailboxes, the log is going to show something like this. It'll show that it received the event for activating, and it gives you the entire mailbox name that it's active for. It shows that it is activating that mailbox, and then it shows you that it's successfully activated. Once we see successfully activated, this email engine is going to be processing emails for that mailbox. In this case, we see that it's becoming active for 2 different mailboxes. Now, on a server that's in the waiting state, we'll also see in the log that it actively tells us that it knows it's in the waiting state. It says the email engine is asserting the waiting state. And in this case, it's asserting that for 3 mailboxes. So in this case, the log from one of these email engines is telling us that, yes, I know I'm waiting on 3 mailboxes. Another thing to look for in the logs is an error message. An example might be that the heartbeat isn't being updated because the email engine couldn't connect to AIR server. So we'll look for something like this where it says it had a problem connecting to the AIR server. And that's going to explain why the heartbeat wasn't updated and also why it didn't receive an event for activating or asserting its waiting state. Most important is to simply validate that the heartbeat was actually sent. An easy way to do this is to enable the API recording log. This is set in a file called arsys_api.xml. Now, originally this file exists as a file called arsys_sample. You need to rename it to arsys_api, edit it, look for the API recording line, and set the value in there for to 31. That's a good log. The number is maximum logging that's going to be useful. Once you set that, you can restart the email engine. It'll create a file of the form Remedy Application Service, which is the account that the email engine is using, followed by the server name, port number, and then _AR_API_res.log. In my case, the file name was called Remedy Application Service, Remedy prod 1, 0 for the port, and then _AR_API_res.log. To check for the heartbeat, I'm looking for a create entry API call to the AR system service failover interface form. And I'll see that once for each mailbox that it owns. So in this case, I look at the log and I see the CE, the create entry. I see the interface form listed there. I see the mailbox name, and then I finally see the results, which is null, meaning that it was successful. So this tells me that a successful heartbeat update was made, and I'll look for this for any mailboxes that this email engine owns. While I'm looking at that log, that AR API res log, I can also look to see if the email engine even checked for its status and what it found. So to check for the status is going to be a query, which in Remedy terms is a get list entry with fields, GLEWF, and it's going to be on the whiteboard form. So in that same log, I see this. I see a GLEWF on the whiteboard form, and I see a bunch of results that come back. The thing I'm looking for is field 1436, which is the service status. And you can see here, I just pasted in that field from the form. 0 is unavailable, 1 is waiting, 2 is active, 3 is suspending. In this case, they came back as a 2, which means it's active. So I can tell from that log that this email engine knows that it's going to be active for that particular mailbox, in this case, SMTP mailbox number 1. Lastly, make sure that service failover is ranked. This actually is something that's quite often missed because people aren't really sure what this service failover operation is. This operation handles the coordination of the mailboxes and assigning them based on their rank. If this operation isn't running, the email engines will not be assigned ownership of the mailboxes and they'll not process them. This is actually one of those operations that you probably want to rank on all of your servers. If email is important to you, then if any of your servers are still up, you want the service failover operation still running. So this is, like I said, this is one of those that you probably want to rank across all servers in your group, even the user-facing ones. One more common issue with configuration is simply that the email daemon.properties file is set incorrectly. So a symptom might be that emails are not being sent out, and the cause is that the email engine isn't configured properly. Kind of a generic problem, but this does happen quite often. The things that we're going to look for are the email daemon.properties settings and the centralized configuration settings to make sure they're set up properly. It's important to know that the centralized configuration form is the main place to set and check email engine settings. It synchronizes with the email daemon.properties file, but there are some settings that are in the file that are not in the centralized configuration. These are the settings that the email engine uses to connect to AR server. These settings also are used to populate the centralized configuration in the service failover ranking form. So earlier I mentioned that the first time you start up the email engine, it'll populate the ranking form with the server name, and it gets the server name from this file. So all of these settings are required to be in the email daemon.properties file. Now these are the default settings that you'll find in the centralized configuration. If you use a component type of arsys.emaildaemon, this is what you're going to see. And you'll notice that the settings I showed on the prior slide aren't in here. So they're all shared as part of the email daemon properties settings, but some are stored in the file, the rest are stored in the form. The centralized configuration form using the email daemon component type is where you'll modify or add any email daemon.properties settings. So let's look at some of the common settings that people use for troubleshooting. The first one is fetch user group info on demand. By default, this is set to false, which means when the email engine starts up, it loads all of the user and group information into its cache. Now, if you had thousands or hundreds of thousands or more users and or groups, it might take a while to load all the group user and group information into cache. It also might cause a memory to grow. So we would set this to true when the email engine startup is slow, or if Java heap is bloated, and if we knew we had a lot of users and groups, we'd set it to true. And what that does is it only loads the users and groups into memory when they're actually needed. So there's no loss of functionality. It's basically a pay me now, pay me later thing. But if you do have slow startup or Java heap bloated, this is a great option to look at. Very, very low risk in my opinion too. The next one to look at is arsystem_handler.level. By default, this is set to off. This is what enables a logging into the AirSystem email error logs form. Any of you guys that upgraded from an earlier version into 9X, you might have noticed, hey, my AirSystem email error logs form no longer has information in it, and that's because by default the level is set to off. If you need it, if you want to use that kind of logging, and it is useful, then you need to set the handler.level to severe. We recommend not setting it higher than severe, just because it's a form, which means it's a table, and we don't want to have load tons of data in there if it's not needed. The emaildaemon.level is what sets the log level into the email.log file, which we'll use a lot. By default, this is set to severe, but when you're troubleshooting, you're often going to set it to finest. And the last one we'll look at as a common setting is the save sent item is true. I say it's common. Customers that have performance issues often consider setting this. By default, every message that is an outgoing type is saved. Now, if you're using email approvals, this has to be true. You have to leave it as true. And the reason is email approvals require that the original outgoing message that was sent to the user for the approval has to be there for comparison. We have to compare the modify key on the response that the user sent back in. We have to compare that with the outgoing. So for approvals, you don't get to change this. But if you're not using approvals, you can set this to false, and it will delete all sent messages. And that includes not only notifications, but it also includes email responses and status messages that were a response from an incoming message.
So now we'll move into discussing some connectivity issues, which can be directly related to the service failover configuration Doug has just covered. One such scenario could be where the email engine is unable to connect to the AR server due to some misconfiguration in the email daemon.properties file. So let's look at a scenario where the email engine is unable to connect to the AR system server and discuss the causes and troubleshooting steps. Again, since the email engine connectivity to the AR server is primarily controlled by the configuration information in the email daemon.properties file, misconfiguration of this file would be the first thing to look at. It's typical that you may find this out if, after you've started the email engine and waited a while, you see that there are no emails processing. A quick check of the email log will help you determine this is due to the email engine being unable to connect to the AR server, since that's one of the first actions that is logged. We'll look more at what to look for in the logs and logging levels later. You'll also want to check some specific connection parameters in the email daemon.properties file to make sure they are correct. Another tool that may help is the AR server's actual API logging. Since the email engine is a client to the AR server, all of the communications are via the AR API calls. Enabling the API logging on the AR server and then checking for any specific activity can be useful in troubleshooting connectivity issues for the email engine to the AR server. Here we see the parameters from the email daemon.properties file that tell the email engine how and which AR server to connect to. Their parameters are specific to each email daemon.properties file, so they have to be right in each server settings. They are not located in the centralized configuration settings, and this is because the centralized configuration settings are data on a form, which is, of course, a table in the database. So the email engine first has to read the email daemon.properties file in order to know what AR server to connect to before it can start making API calls to the AR server to retrieve data from the database for its configuration settings and, of course, the other forms such as the mailbox configuration, the messages, and so on. As the email engine is a client to the AR server and uses the standard AR API calls to connect, this can make the use of API and even SQL logging valuable in troubleshooting connection issues. In some scenarios, the AR API recording log may be helpful here as well. As a reminder, that has to be set using the ARSys API XML file. Another common connectivity issue is when the email engine is unable to connect to the mail server. This could be due to some misconfiguration with the mailbox configuration form, network issues, or even mail server issues. So some suggestions on what to check and look for, of course, are the email engine's log. Make sure that your protocol configurations are correct, including the settings for TLS, SSL, port numbers, etc. And also we have an email connectivity test utility you can use to verify the connection to the mail server. And we'll talk more about that in detail just a little bit. You also want to confirm that you're using the correctly configured and allowed mail protocols for your environment. The mail protocols supported by the email engine are POP3, IMAP4, MBOX, and MAPI for incoming, followed by SMTP and MAPI for outgoing. As noted here, MAPI is Windows only and does require the 32-bit Java. If you'll be using MAPI, make sure that you selected the 32-bit Java for MAPI options when you installed the AR server. If you didn't, then the installer would have laid down the 64-bit email engine binaries, which means you'll have to obtain the 32-bit binaries from the installer, swap them out, and then modify your email engine registry key to point to the 32-bit Java, all in order to use the MAPI protocol. It's a little bit of extra work, but it can be done. Also noted here, MBOX is a Unix-only protocol. So some of the other possible hindrances for the email engine's ability to connect to the mail server could be with the network, security, or incorrect data in the configuration form. For network issues, you want to check the email engine log for any network-related errors. You may see errors indicating unable to connect or something like could not connect to the server name on port number, whatever, for example. Another possibility is the port that you specified for incoming or outgoing mailbox is not blocked anywhere on the network. Consider engaging your network admins and your mail server admins to check for traffic on the network and the calls and connections to the mail server from the email engine. They're a good resource to utilize in times of troubleshooting. For security, SSL and TLS, be sure to confirm if SSL is required for the protocol being used. Confirm with your mail admin again if the mail server requires SSL or not, and then make sure it's set per those requirements. If you confirmed SSL is required, do you have an SSL certificate? If you do, check to make sure the SSL certificate on the email engine server is not expired or invalid. There are SSL utilities that can help you to confirm this, such as SSL Poke. In addition to SSL, it's important to know if TLS is required for the protocol being used for the specific mailbox. Since the email engine uses Java Mail, most Java Mail parameters can be used with the email engine, among those being the various TLS parameters. To implement them with the email engine, on Windows, you need to edit the registry key for the service, or if you're using the email start.bat, you can add the TLS parameters to the batch file as needed. On Unix, of course, you would edit the emaild.sh startup script. Finally, make sure the information in the Mailbox configuration form on the Basic tab is correct, as the data entered into this form is not validated by the email engine, but simply used as entered. Now here we see an example of the registry key for the BMC Remedy email engine service, showing the parameters subkey where the TLS parameters for SMTP were added. In this configuration, we have the SMTP TLS parameters indicating that TLS is both required and enabled. As you can see, they are JVM options that are added and specified. On this slide, we see from a Windows server the email start.bat file, for example, showing the TLS parameters, again for enabling and requiring TLS with SMTP. From the emaild.sh startup script, we see the same TLS parameters enabling and requiring TLS for SMTP. So always remember that before editing your email start.bat or the email.sh files, you should, in order to add these parameters, you want to make sure that you take a backup of the file just for precautionary purposes. Now we'll discuss a little bit more about the email engine logs, what logs, where they are located, and how you enable them, as well as what log levels to set. For 9.x and above, the email engine log on Windows is the email.log, and on Unix, the file is called emaild.sh_log. Again, the logging levels for the email engine are set in the Centralized configuration console under the email daemon component. Logging is set on a per server basis, so be sure to select the email daemon.server name for the server you wish to enable and set the logging for. Typically, this would be the server that owns the email operations and is ranked #1 for service failover. The two settings to consider are email daemon.level and arsystemhandler.level. Both logging properties have the same multiple logging levels. However, it's recommended for troubleshooting. You set the email daemon.level to finest and the arsystemhandler level to severe. Reproduce the problem, analyze the email log, or open a case and send it in to support for assistance with the analysis. There's also the debug logging, which is an enhancement to the previous log levels and can be used independently of the email daemon logging. It will provide additional detail not logged in the email daemon logging levels. It does require the Java mail parameter of -dmail.debug equals true to be set. On Windows, you can either set this in the registry key for the service, or if you're using the batch file, it can be added to the batch file as well when you run it from the command line. On Unix, you would set it in the emaild.sh startup script. Looking at an example of logging, here we see the email daemon level was set to finest, but this doesn't include any debug logging. As you can see by the highlighted lines, their finest level includes logging for all the various levels, such as info, fine, and finest, and for each module that it will log for. So it would include severe as well. We didn't have an example in this slide deck, but if there was a severe error, you would see it here as well. Here we also see where the email is querying the AR server for any new outgoing emails, but it finds no emails to be sent. Note too how it shows the mailbox name, which includes the mailbox function of outgoing, followed by the test MTB outgoing mailbox name. On the next slide, we'll look at more focused is the debug options for logging. Here we see an excerpt from the log where the debug option with the -dmail.debug equals true was enabled and set. In this example, we're focusing on the actual debug information, so to give you an idea of what it will show and what to look for in the logs. This is showing the debug log line and commands for the POP3 protocol. Here we see where the receiver module shows it's checking the incoming messages, and then the debug output shows it connected to the mail-enabled POP3 server. It received an OK status with a 0. This is indicating that there were no incoming messages, and then it quits. So with the debug option enabled, you'll see the keyword debug in the log, helping to identify the additional log lines. Now earlier on, we talked about the connectivity utility. We call it the email connectivity test utility, and I'd like to go through that in a little more detail here. So this utility allows you to test your mailbox configuration settings independently of the email engine. Typically, it's best to download and run this utility on the system where the email engine is installed, as this will help to validate the connectivity from that server to the mail server. This is especially useful when validating network connectivity issues. It can be extracted and run from any directory, and it does not have to be specifically put into the AR email install directory. So if you have limitations on what you can put into that directory, you can specify any location, because all the files that are needed to run the utility are included with it. So the utility is run from a command line, and it's prompt driven. You'll want to use the same connection values from the AR system email mailbox configuration form when using the utility, so as to validate the values independently of the email engine. Since the utility, like the email engine, uses Java Mail, you can also specify the debug logging options along with various TLS options for each protocol. In the example that we see here, we have it set to debug logging along with TLS with SMTP being enabled and true. The JVM options are all interchangeable and must be set depending on the protocol you're using. So if you're going to test for your POP3 mailbox that's required with TLS, you'll set the parameters for start TLS for POP3 equals true and enable this for an example like that. So again, the protocols that allow for TLS are IMAP4, POP3, and SMTP. Here's an example of running the test email batch file being run on test to a mail server where we're using an SMTP mailbox. The first section under please provide the following input shows the input provided by the user at each prompt. The second section under testing email with the following parameters is like it replays to the user the values that were entered, and it's basically saying here's what we're going to test with. So finally we see the results where this test case was a simple email was sent. Next, we're going to look at an example of the same batch file being run to the same SMTP mailbox, but we've misspelled the user password intentionally. As in the previous slide, the first section shows the input provided by the user. And note here the purposely misspelled password under please provide the following input. In the playback section, you can see again how we misspelled the password of Remedy with an IE at the end instead of a Y. Finally, we see the results where in this case an authentication error was received and the test failed. It's important to note, as you can see here, that the password will be in clear text. Sometimes this is a concern for customers, especially I know that that's happened when I've been on WebExes, so I always want to make sure that everybody knows when you're using the utility, the password will be in clear text, but this is intentional so that the values can be seen and validated as they are tested. So to recap the utility, its purpose is to test the connectivity to the email server using the same values as entered in the AR system email mailbox configuration form. Again, it does not validate the input parameters, but rather uses what is entered at the prompt. So you have to make sure all your inputs are correct. It can be used to test for incoming or outgoing functionality by sending and receiving a sample email for all the supported protocols, including MAPI. If you are using MAPI, you must be logged into the OS as the MAPI user account. You'll want to refer to the how-to test doc for the utility for details on instructions when using MAPI. Another important to note when using MAPI is to remember that it requires 32-bit Java, so be sure to set the path environment variable to a valid 32-bit Java directory before running the utility from the command line. And finally, in addition to the debug settings, you can also configure the utility to use the TLS protocols that, which again, are the SMTP, POP3, and IMAP4. All right, so now that we've covered some common connectivity issues, the logging, and the email connectivity test utility, let's move on to some performance.
So the third common issue that we want to talk about today with the email engine is performance. A typical symptom that we get is that emails are just not being sent out in a timely manner. A possible cause for this, and a likely cause as we've seen, is that email engine is just taking too long to query for messages. So the things that we're going to look for are a huge volume of data in the email forms and to check if you have enabled the archive for email engine. When working with a performance issue, the first thing you want to do is make sure that you've looked at the latest recommended hotfixes, because there is a hotfix that can significantly help with email engine performance. If you're on 9104, make sure you're on patch 2 with a hotfix dated at least August 6th. If you're on 1805, on any patch level, make sure you're on a hotfix that's dated August 17th or later. 1808 includes the fix already, so you don't need to worry about that. But it's always a good recommendation, and support recommends this in general, that you look at our recommended hotfixes, and if there's and in this case, there is likely a fix if you have performance issues. Another thing to look at is the delete notifications option for your outgoing mailboxes. Some customers can make use of this and some can't. This is based on your retention policy, but if you can make use of it, this can help with performance, because if you don't have delete notifications sent, then every notification that's going out, and in some of your environments it's a lot of notifications, all of those messages are being kept in the messages form. Well, every time the email engine comes in, it has to look at that form to see if there's any work to do. It has to go through all of those messages that you may not need. So again, based on your retention policy, if you can choose the delete notification option, that may really help with your performance issues. The next thing to look at is a polling interval. You want to set this to a low enough number in minutes so that you're not just simply waiting for the next cycle. So if you say you had set this to 2 minutes, well, every time the email engine does its work, it's then going to pause for 2 minutes, not doing any work, and then it's going to come back after 2 minutes and do more work. So you can imagine, if it was if it was 15 seconds or 30 seconds instead of 2 minutes, and if you have a lot of emails going out, that can significantly help. There is a setting, I think Mike mentioned, that you can set this to seconds or minutes. So depending on your environment, you can choose to set this to seconds and have maybe set it to 15 or 30 seconds. So the common issue with performance is that there's simply too many records in the email messaging forms, and that can affect performance. The email messaging forms are the AR system email messages, AR system email attachments, and AR system email association forms. So it's a best practice to manage the size of those forms. In general, the more records that you have in these forms, the more it can potentially affect performance. There's not a one-to-one relationship, and the exact number of records that's going to cause you a problem is going to be specific to your environment. It may have to do with the size of your attachments, how many attachments that you use. So I can't give you an exact number to look at. It's just a good idea to be actively managing the size of these forms. So you can look at the size of the forms simply by querying the forms from the mid-tier client. In some cases, when there's a huge number of records, you may not even be able to do that because just the query to find out how many records are in there may time out. I mean, we've had customers that have had millions of records in there, and just querying it doesn't work. So in that case, you can use a SQL script or a simple SQL query to find out. Here I have the 3 little queries to give you the count on the 3 different forms. And I ran it. In my case, I saw over 500,000 records in the association and messages form and 250,000 in the attachments form. So at this point, I may decide I need to do something about these forms because I have a performance issue. First thing I need to do is decide on what can be removed. This will be different for every customer. We have customers that can't delete information and less than 7 years old. Some customers 5 years. It just depends on your retention policies. But once you decide what can be removed, you can manually delete the records from the AR system email messages form. What you might want to do is start with performing a query based on create date. For example, look at all the records that are over 5 years old based on create date. You can delete all the incoming messages at that point and delete the outgoing messages that have been sent. Now, if it's 5 years, you can probably delete all the outgoing messages, even the ones that haven't been sent, because they're probably of no use at this point. What's really handy for you is, I mentioned there's 3 forms that are related, but when you delete messages from the messages form, there are out-of-the-box filters that run on the delete action that'll automatically delete the related records in the attachments and association form. So that makes it really easy. You delete it in one place, and it deletes it automatically for you in the other 2 places. So one thing you want to consider is, out of the box, AR System ships with an archive policy meant to help with this very thing. We've seen issues with performance with high volumes, and so we've provided an archive policy to help you with this. If you go to the Archive Management Console, you'll see a policy called AR System Email Messages, archive all incoming messages as well as successfully sent messages with specified age qualification. All you need to do is change the -1 in the custom specified age and days column. -1 means disabled, and change that to an appropriate value. In your case, it might be a year and a half. It might be the 548 that they have there, or it might be 5 years. Whatever it is, you specify that here, and archiving will start managing that form for you. It is important to note that archiving is single-threaded. So in the case that maybe you're that customer that had 5 million records in there and you enable this policy, it's probably not going to solve your performance issue tomorrow. It may take a few days, may take potentially, depending on the number of records, it could take weeks before it can handle all those, get rid of all the old records. So if you aren't having a performance issue right now, you might consider enabling this policy. It's a good policy if you think about it. Old messages I probably don't need to keep, but I don't want to have to manually go in there and do a query and delete them. Well, just edit the policy, set it up so that it's managing it for you. So let's look at, in review, of some of the diagnostic tools that we've talked about today. First, you have the email.log. That's the main log. And when you're troubleshooting, you likely want to set it to finest level. You also have the AR System Email Error Logs form that you can enable and set it to severe. We recommend not setting it to a higher level than severe. You have the -d mail.debug equals true setting that Mike talked about. You can use that for connectivity settings. Another thing you can do is use it for other issues where you question the content of the incoming or outgoing message. Maybe you have an incoming message and it's not populating the HTML body correctly. You can use this setting because the log will show the entire message content, including the header info. So that's really cool when troubleshooting, especially I think when troubleshooting incoming messages. It's really handy to see the exact full message that came in. And lastly, we have the email connectivity test tool. This is a really good tool to test the settings that you have. This is something you might not want to wait until you have a problem. Go ahead and download the utility, learn how to use it, make sure it works, and then if you do have a problem, you can just go and validate your information against this utility. So we provided some references for you based on some of the content we've talked about. We have an article on how to enable TLS. We have the connectivity test tool that you can download, and it has instructions. There's an article on how to clean up email messaging forms to improve performance, and that includes some SQL scripts that will do the counts for you so you don't have to remember those SQL statements. We have an article on enabling the API recording. We talked about that kind of quickly, so if you want to go back and enable that logging, you'll want this article. And lastly, we have an article on how to set the -d mail.debug equals true. That's hard to say, and you probably didn't remember it, so you might want to look at that article. And that concludes our session for today.
Thank you, Doug. And that brings us into the Q&A time. And Derek, if you would be able to provide instructions for our callers to signal us for questions.
Absolutely. And ladies and gentlemen, if you'd like to ask a question over your phone at this time, please signal by pressing *1 on your telephone keypad. If you are using a speakerphone, please make sure your mute function is turned off to allow your signal to reach our equipment. A voice prompt on the phone line will indicate when your line is open. Again, that is *1 to signal for a question at this time. And we'll take our first question. Please go ahead.
Oh, yes. Can you hear me, sir?
Yes.
Yes, please go ahead.
Can hear you.
Our system is using a 2-server group in AR2 servers. We noticed that our vendor, when they install it, they always disable one email engine on one server and leave the other one, the primary one, running. So according to today's webinar, looks like we need to set up ranking and make sure they can fail over to each other. Is this correct? Is my understanding correct?
Right, yes. The way that we have the service failover feature running is both email engines will be live and running all the time, and they will know whether or not they own a mailbox. And the great thing about having it already up and running is if one of the mailboxes doesn't send a heartbeat, maybe it's dead or maybe something's going on, it can't send a heartbeat, well then pretty immediately within the next minute, that other email engine, it's already running, it's going to get the signal that it now needs to take over that mailbox. And so it'll be a pretty quick failover. So yes, keep them both up and running, and follow the instructions we set here today, and make sure that your service failover is all set up properly. And the way that you have it set up now with only one of them running, you're not going to get high availability. You won't get the second mailbox immediately taking over. So yeah, you want to set that up.
Thank you.
And as a reminder, that's *1 on your telephone keypad to signal for a question at this time. And we'll move to our next question. Please go ahead.
Hi, I wish we would have had this webinar yesterday, but I was on an issue for 2 days with our Exchange folks because we have a server group, Linux environments, primary and secondary server, both run an email, doing a POP3 connection, checking for incoming. And all of our environments, dev, sit, cat, and prod, all stopped sending or checking incoming email. And we were could not connect. And long story short, we were able to isolate through the server ranking page, flip the mailboxes from one server to the next, because on the back end of the VIP for POP3, 1 or 2 out of the 25 Exchange servers that we had were actually bad. And we could flip between the different 2 servers and isolate to verify when we were connected to a good one. With doing a network sniffer, we could tell which one we're on, and we saw emails coming in. And we had to flip them back and forth, and we were able to pinpoint it back to the Exchange group and tell them, to fix their servers. But would have there been an easier way to identify that, do you think?
That's a good question. And I want to say that the utility would have helped. I don't know for certain, but if you could have isolated it, not deal with the ranking, not deal with email engine logging and trying to figure all that out. But it's possible that utility would have helped because you would have put in the information to your Exchange server, try to run it, and if you were connected to one of those 2 servers that had a problem, you would have seen an error right there proactively in that utility. So that's probably what, if you would have called into support, I probably would have asked you to use that utility to verify the connection.
Yeah, I think that utility would have helped, but the server ranking page actually helped as well in diagnosing it. Yeah, but I mean, as soon as you got past the VIP for the POP3, it was like in the Never Never Land. You couldn't tell where it was going. And even the Exchange group couldn't identify which, so that's why we needed somebody from network perimeter to actually do the sniffing to identify. But yeah,
that's a tough one when you got a bank of Exchange servers, or you're not connected to one entity, you're connected to a bank of them. That makes it a lot more difficult.
Well, that makes me feel better that it took 2 days to figure out. I think we got it handled pretty quickly then. All right, thank you.
I'm not sure if the mail server would the mail server failover form would have helped here possibly as well?
Yeah, we have if you aren't familiar with this, we have another option that we didn't talk about today, but there's another form that's a mail server failover form, where if you ever have a connection problem from the email engine to a particular mail server, you can have it automatically connect to a different mail server.
Oh, really? You can control it even after it passes through the VIP? Because we're checking POP3, the VIP, and then that VIP is handing off to one of the 25 servers.
Yeah, that makes it difficult, but yeah, I don't know if you can solve this, but with that mail server failover form, at least what you could do is hard code in a physical, this is an option.
I see what you said, yeah. Put multiple mail servers in there, okay, correct.
Yeah. Yeah,
okay.
That's an option you might consider.
I do have one side question. There is another feature within Remedy, a more robust email feature where you can, process emails into the system. What is it called, RDB or?
RBE, yeah.
RBE, yeah, RBE. What's your take on that? I mean, are the features worthwhile? I mean, we've always used custom forms to process and create incidents via email. Are there?
Yeah, it can be very complex, and you know we've had to do this internally ourselves when we support tickets being created via email. It can get really complex. Some environments aren't that complex. Some environments you send in an email, all you do is take whatever the body is and dump it into the HPD incident create form or whatever. RBE tries to make it easier for complex environments where you can set up rules. You can set up rules for your email, what it looks like, and where it's going to populate that email. If you're finding it okay to use just the workflow that you've created and it's not too complex, then you don't need to worry about it. But if you have a complex environment where perhaps you want to create tickets in different forms, you want to take information to populate in different fields, then RBE is probably worth looking at.
Okay, yeah, I mean, the custom form that we built, or I built, I added enhancements to take, for instance, when you get multiple from email addresses in there to parse out and identify a valid one, or find keywords in the subject line, or who it's from, where it's invalid, whether it's undeliverable, out of office, and stuff like that to prevent email loops. But yeah, it's definitely tricky, but
it is.
I think we got it down pretty well.
Yeah, you may not need it, but that's why we created it, is because it does get tricky, and you can end up creating a full application just to handle email processing.
Yeah, that's what we pretty much did. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, hey, and by the way, thank you for putting the email account information, the user account information in the login, so when there's a bad username and password, you can actually see the account name that's doing the offense.
Oh, great.
Thank you. Next question, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So, hi. So I'm at a university, and we actually have 27 email accounts set up in our system, and they're all tied to incident with RBE rules, so they each have custom rules. Some of them even grab voicemails from a VoIP phone and create tickets out of that. So it's a pretty large setup now, and we have the interval set to almost all the mailboxes down to 1. The problem is that they're all Gmail boxes, and from time to time Google's been flagging us because we have 2 mail engines, but it's basically failover. So number 1 is logging in 27 times per minute to different mailboxes. So Google's been flagging us from time to time, giving us warnings. I'm going to take some mailboxes that are less priority and give them higher times. But if I split and take, let's say, 13 mailboxes and then the rest on another server, if one server goes down, then I lose the emails from the first 13 servers. They don't fail over if I split the mailboxes. Is that correct?
Mike, did you follow that? I lost it right at the end.
Yeah. So
I think you're.
Yeah, if I have all 27 on server 1 right now, and then if I split them and let's say 15 on one server and then the rest on another server, if one of the servers goes down, it won't pick up the mailboxes from the main server. You know what I mean? Because it's either all or nothing with that.
If you if you have service failover set, is that you're saying you're using service failover and you have 2 email engines running,
right?
And you have them split up, kind of like the first picture I showed, with the 2 email engines. Yeah. So if one of those fails, the other one, and if you have it ranked so that the other email engine is ranked number 2 for all of them, then that second email engine will process all of the mailboxes.
So it'll pick up all the mail, even though the mailboxes are set differently, where, let's say, I specify, the first 15 accounts only get processed on server 1, and the rest get processed on server 2. So if server 1 fails, it picks up the slack and handles all 27 boxes?
Yes, it does. And remember, the information to connect to those mail servers is in the mailbox configuration form. So that second email engine, when the first one fails, that second email engine is going to read the mailbox configuration is going to say, hey, I got 17 more mailboxes, and I know all of their host names to connect to and all the information. And it creates a set of threads for each mailbox. And so it's basically to spawn up 17 new connections to those different mailboxes, and it should handle all of them just fine. That's the intention, is that it will handle all your mailboxes. Now, it may not perform well if it's doing too many mailboxes. You may end up having I don't know how many threads you're going to use ultimately, but it may end up being a resource issue, a performance issue if it's handling too much. We have customers that the amount of emails that are coming in is just phenomenal, and if you didn't split it, there'd be a performance issue. So during a failover, yeah, you might have a performance issue, but at least it'll process them.
Okay, yeah, because right now we have them all on just one server, all 2701, and I do have it failing over, so it can fail over onto server 2, but still it's the same scenario where all the 27 boxes are on one server, hitting Google at the same time, and then Google occasionally.
I would have it. Yeah, I'd recommend that you try the service failover.
Yeah, I'm gonna try splitting the boxes that way, because we just occasionally get the flagging from Google, and it still processes the message, but people get alarmed. Oh, why is Google flagging our mailbox? And it's like it's just because it's logging in so many times from the same IP address to so many mailboxes. Yep.
Yep, I would definitely try that. It's and you'll gain out of the box. You say you don't have a performance issue, but out of the box you'll gain potential performance gain, and plus you get high availability. And it's a good way to it's an easy way to distribute your load.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And once again, that is *1 to ask a question. We'll take our next question. Please go ahead.
Yeah, hi, this is Amit. Am I audible?
Hi. Yes.
Yeah. So actually, as I mentioned several times, I'm facing the same issue, performance issue. But the problem in my case is not the time taken to process email. The issue is the size of the email messages in the database. So the table size of the email messages from in database is almost 70 GB. In my case, daily almost 10 to 15,000 email records are getting created. And even if we go for the archiving option, anyway, it's another table in the database, so the database size issue will be there. So is there any alternate way for this? I tried creating the older emails using SQL query, but if I use SQL query, only record from the T table will get deleted. The record from the B table and H table remains there.
Right. That is a concern. Yes. Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, no, I was going to say probably the same thing. It is a concern when you're deleting tables, data directly from the database, that there are the companion tables so you have the T tables, the main table, the H and the B and possibly BC tables. But there's also other forms that you have to take into consideration. There's the association form for one. So if you delete a record from the AR system email mailbox messages form, there's workflow that fires that deletes all the companion records in all the tables, of course, but also the other companion forms. So this is one of the reasons that we recommend using the archive function. If you can set up the archiving, customize it to meet your archiving needs, it'll help to keep the record count down in the forms, but it takes care of all the associated forms, not just the AR system email messages form. So it's something that you can do if you do it within, Remedy, within the user interface. That's the best method that we recommend.
But archiving won't resolve the database size issue, right? The data will still remain in the database, but in different going form instead of
right. Well, there's different options for archiving. So if you can archive and just delete the record, so it doesn't even write to the archive form. But if you don't need to keep it, that's one thing. Another thing that we have had customers do or worked with customers in the past is creating escalations, this is a little bit more work and does take up some resources, and you want to do it all, maybe run it off hours, but it's a possibility is, creating a custom escalation that runs to delete messages that meet certain criteria, probably date-wise, that will just go into the email messages form and delete the records. And then again, since you're doing it within Remedy, all the companion records in the other forms will also be taken care of, and that helps to reduce the count overall as well.
Yes, actually, I tried the escalation. I tried deleting records older than 3 months in the escalation, but eventually I got database timeout. So maybe it's because of the huge numbers, huge number of records, but every time I get database you may be at a point where you have so much data that it's taking, it's just going to take a long time to do that. So in cases like this, it may be the need that you have to, go in and work with the DBA to truncate the data at the database level for all the tables related to the, the main table and then the associated forms as well. And that takes a little bit of work, and that may be something that, if archiving doesn't work for you, then that may be something that you need to open a support ticket for and get some assistance with in that regards. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And we have no questions in the no questions in the queue at this time, but I'd like to remind everyone that *1 on your telephone keypad, and we'll pause for a moment for additional questions. And we do have another question. Please go ahead.
Hey, caller, are you there?
And caller, please check your mute function. We're not able to hear you.
Yeah, sorry about that. I'm back. We're getting error messages on incoming and outgoing email messages. It's an error 91, although we have other error messages as well. But it seems to be throwing errors, but it's inconsistent. Sometimes we'll have these error messages and tickets won't get created. Other times we'll get the email or the error message will occur, but they create the tickets. Same with outgoing messages. Sometimes they send, sometimes they don't, even though we're getting error messages. Where is a good place to look if we're seeing those types of issues?
91 errors are not easy because they mean something's wrong with the RPC packet. We don't know what it is necessarily. Sometimes the related message gives you useful information. Because it is an API issue, I would probably start with the AR API reslog, that API recording set to 31. I think that will give you some additional information. That's where I would start. This is, it's probably not, and that just by the sound of it, it's not an easy issue. If you haven't created a support ticket already, you might want to do that. But if you want to start on your own, I would start with the setting API recording to 31. If you've never used the AR API reslog before, it's a great opportunity. It's a great log, not just for email engine, but for any API call, any API client. I've used this for years for a lot of different things. So if you haven't used it before, maybe now is a good time to learn how to use that log.
We're a hosted environment, and so I did create a ticket, and they're actually logging. So, we're going to take a look at the logs later on. I just, the tickets have been open for a while, and the issue still is happening. I'm just trying to figure out and help any way I can to diagnose the
91 sometimes happen with email engine because of large attachments. That's one thing. If you don't have large attachments, or if there aren't any attachments, then it may be a network issue. Again, 91 means there's something wrong with the network connection over RPC, and it could be just so many things that went wrong. It's just really it's a vague, sort of a vague error message. It's kind of hard to troubleshoot, but you could look at.
If that's the case,
go ahead.
One of the things, of course, that we don't want to do is emails being sent out or emails creating tickets. What do you do? I mean, how do you ensure that? Do you look at the logs every day and then reprocess this stuff? I mean, what do people do if they're experiencing?
I don't want to get too much into this, but there's a new feature in the server group admin console. If you're on 1805 or above, or even 9104 has a downloadable feature for this, but there's a server group admin console, has a dashboard on it, and that dashboard shows you the number of email messages that are waiting to be sent. So it's a way to quickly look at how many messages should have been sent but haven't been. And you can also use that interface to create other flashboards to do the similar thing. I think out of the box, I don't remember, I think there's 2 email engine related dashboards there just to help with that very thing, to understand what's not being done with email engine.
And caller, please check your mute function. We're not able to hear you.
Hey guys, can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, how's it going, guys? This is Steve Seitz. How's everyone doing? Good to see a lot of familiar names. Good to see you guys.
Steve.
Here's the situation that we typically find is that, okay, first of all, we're still running our legacy system at 7.6, so you can make what you will of that. But outgoing email is classified as a Sub 1, and we run in a server group environment. And what I typically see is that when we have an issue where outgoing email is not being processed, we're seeing that the email engine is running and there's no errors, but the outgoing email is simply not being processed. And what we typically do in that situation is I found that just restarting the email engine doesn't necessarily correct it. It's usually a case of I usually have to bounce the entire server, kind of do a shutdown and a restart. And that seems to correct it for a while, but it is kind of frustrating in that we really haven't identified an error, but we do see that outgoing email does, for whatever reason, start accumulating, and it doesn't process even though everything else seems to be running. I think I might want to check.
What version?
Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
It's 764, Service Pack 4. It's pretty old. I'm not anticipating any hotfixes, but at least from this conversation, it seems like maybe I could check into the failover. That might want to check that, maybe some items in the registry. But is there any KDs or anything I can look for the KDs seem to be far more modern.
Yeah. 9.x changes a lot drastically how failover is handled. In 7604, we used RMI to poke an email engine to let it know that it needs to do something. It's possible that you have problems with that RMI signal and that the email engine is up, but it thinks that it's not active. But the way that we handled that was a lot different in 7604, and it's a lot better in 9.x. So, without upgrading, you just have to kind of deal with that. The problem might be, you can tell if you turn on the finest logs for email engine, you can tell whether or not that email engine thinks it's active or suspended. It's possible that if you can't see anything else that's wrong, it could be that email engine is running. It just thinks it's suspended. And it's possible too, I think you said that when you restarted it, it also didn't help. And it's possible that when it restarted, it also went into suspended mode. So you can tell that, you can identify that with the finest logging. So that's something you might want to do. It's probably it sounds like a bigger issue. It might need some discussion and log analysis and stuff. So if you haven't done it yet, I'd create a ticket.
One of the other things.
Go ahead.
This is Steve. This is Mike Fahrenbruch. I was going to say one of the other things that you want to consider too. I don't know what's your count in your forms, because one of the biggest performance hindrances, especially in the previous versions, was too many records in the form. And Doug kind of touched on that in one of the slides, I think. But that's something to consider as well. So the higher the form record counts are for the email engine, the messages form and association form, that the more chances you have of running into performance issues.
Yeah, I can almost guarantee that that's probably going to be an issue with my company, because we have a tendency to keep things far too long. I know access notifications, we probably are pushing close to 30 million records in that form. I would start there for starters. I would look at what's your counts. There's a KA at the end of this presentation
or you can run some queries. I think the KA has a small script too. You can run for SQL or Oracle, but basically you could just run the commands too from a database query tool to see what your counts are in those forms, and that'll give you a good indication. Is that's a pretty good performance issue that's been known for a while. It's just that there's so many records, and because of the way the email engine queries the database, the higher the record counts, the more likely you are to possibly encounter performance issues. And if you're what you're saying, you know, here on the call, of course, I can't say for sure without seeing the logs, but what you're indicating here is that, you know, something that sounds very familiar, and that it's just there's not really any errors, but it's just not it doesn't seem to be processing any outbound emails. That's very typical of the scenario where there's just flat out too many records. And there's no kind of indication as to say, you know, once you hit a high watermark of X number of records, you might start encountering it. It just depends, but the chances of encountering problems with performance increase substantially when your record counts are, you know, extremely high. So that's something to consider.
Yeah, we've long suspected something along those lines because we will restart the servers on, you know, a fairly periodic basis, being Windows machines. So, but I've noticed that we've had trouble. We've had the machine be stable for 3 weeks, and you know, we've also seen it where we've restarted it, and 2 days later we're having problems. So it doesn't seem to be an issue that's tied to how fresh the machine is. We have seen that if long queries are being run or reports, and we tell people do not do this to the production machine, but if there are long queries such as, we've been running the Pentaho to migrate data, and stuff like that might cause an issue with the email engine being, I guess, like a large impactful query to the database might cause email engine issues, stuff like that. So, but this is legacy. It's been set up for at least probably 8-10 years, so I'm not sure what we can do at this point. We are in the process of going to 9, but the legacy system will be up for at least a while longer. So, okay.
I would definitely look at the record counts for starters and see if there's something that can be done to reduce that.
Okay. You said there's a KB or KA at the end of this presentation. I'll
yes.
note of that. Thank you. Thank you very much. Good to talk to you guys.
Thanks, Steve.
Okay, we'll go to wrap up this month's session. I wanted to review self-help and contacting BMC. We do have a new BMC Remedy and Discovery YouTube channel where these webinars are posted, along with a lot of short videos that are helps on troubleshooting or how to consume a feature within Remedy and Discovery products. Our knowledge base is also available for searching for KBs. It also searches communities, documentation, as well as these YouTube channel videos. So check it out, and you can find something for the problem you're looking for or get additional information. Also, via the normal web, phone, and email technical support, you could reach us, and also via the social channels as well. This video will be posted within a week of today's live showing, along with the Q&A. And I want to thank our presenters, Mike Fahrenbruch and Doug Reif, as well as all of the attendees that joined and make this program successful. Thank you, everyone. And that will conclude this month's Connect with Remedy.